Hello everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining the talk that we're about to have, which I think will be fascinating. As an architecture student, one of the books that influenced me the most was the Passive Solar Energy book, which guided me towards the way buildings should be designed and constructed in a way that responds to their climate and environment. Later on, as a junior architect working in Toronto, I suddenly discovered that there's a guy who thinks we can reach net zero energy in all new buildings by the year 2030. That person showed the path for me, and I know for many other professionals, towards sustainability in buildings. And that person is Ed Mazria and is with us today. So Ed had long been sounding the alarm on climate change. He has built his distinguished career around motivating professionals around the world to enact positive change and take immediate action. His impact on the building design and construction industry is profound, helping to plot a new course for practice in the 21st century. As one of the world's foremost experts on the built environment's role in both causing and curing climate change, Ed addresses the global threat as a design problem, but at the same time as an opportunity, positioning those responsible for planning, designing, and constructing the built environment as a critical resource in creating a healthy, just, and carbon positive future. So Ed, I'm so excited and thankful to have you with us today. And just before I hand it over to you, two housekeeping comments. The first is that for all of you at the end of the talk, we're going to have a Q&A session. So I encourage you to send your questions via the chat. And another thing is that next week, we're having the Zero Carbon Conference in Tel Aviv, 19th of March. We still have some spots left, so I encourage you to register for that event. So Ed, please take it away, and thank you very much again.
Yeah, Trent, thank you so much for inviting me and having me and being able to talk to all your colleagues in Israel. By the way, we've moved the 2030 date up to now because we know, and that's the title of the conference is zero emissions buildings. We know how to do it now, so we need to get on with it and do a whole bunch of other things, which I'll get into in the talk. So before we get to the Q&A, let's start to talk, and then I'm sure there'll be quite a bit of questions once they hear what we have to say. There's a lot of new information in the presentation. So Laurel is going to start.
Today, we will focus on how to decarbonize the built environment. In 2007, we conducted a global emergency teach-in to call attention to the building sector as a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. At the teach-in, I was sitting next to Dr. James Hansen from NASA. I leaned over to Jim and asked him, "When will we see the effects of climate change?" He whispered back, "When we reach 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels." In 2020, we reached 1 degree Celsius. And 2023 is officially the hottest year ever recorded. And we can now see climate change impacts breaking out all over the world. By 2040, Population in the Middle East is projected to increase by about 180 million people. That's the equivalent of adding a city the size of Tel Aviv to the Middle East every 5 months. The Middle East will need 60 million housing units by 2040. It will need 540,000 hospital beds, 73,000 schools, and it will need the infrastructure that comes with all that building. In fact, 3/4 of the world's infrastructure that will exist in 2050 has yet to be built. We know that the built environment is responsible for over 42% of global CO2 emissions. And just 4 construction materials, cement, iron, steel, and aluminum, are responsible for 15% of total global emissions. And that doesn't include all the other building materials, interior materials, HVAC, infrastructure materials, and the transportation emissions due to planning strategies. When you add all that up, the built environment's responsible for over 50% of total global emissions. So how we plan, design, and construct the built environment may very well determine the fate of the planet. The built environment in the Middle East is responsible for more than 38% of its CO2 emissions. You can see that building operations, just building operations, is about 38%. And then you have building the buildings, all the construction, infrastructure, and transportation emissions due to poor planning. In Israel, you see about the same. Building operations at 37%, and then you have a portion of industry and transportation. In 2015, at COP21 in Paris, the world came together and agreed to work to keep global warming well under 2 degrees C, preferably at 1.5 degrees C. In 2021, at COP26 in Glasgow, we issued the 1.5 degrees C communique. We called for 50 to 65% building sector CO2 reduction by 2030, and for a good probability of meeting the 1.5 degrees C target, phasing out emissions by 2040. For just a 50-50 probability, we would need to reach zero emissions no later than 2050. To date, 74 major international firms and 29 organizations have signed on to meet the targets of the communique. Why do we keep hearing about 1.5 degrees C and 2 degrees C? Because the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees C are 2 very different futures. At 2 degrees C, a half a degree difference has a huge impact. At 2 degrees C, 1.7 billion more people will be exposed to severe heat waves every 5 years. 100 to 400 million more people will be at risk of hunger. 1 to 2 billion more people will be without adequate water. At 2 degrees C, we could expect that about 1 billion people will be forced to migrate.
So the question we keep asking ourselves is, can we meet the 1.5 degrees C CO2 emissions targets? This was Toronto in 1891. You see low-rise masonry buildings, bearing wall construction, small spans, small rooms. Keep your eye on the Flatiron building to the left of the screen. This was Toronto in 2010. You see these huge high-rise buildings, horizontal windows, all glass buildings. How did this transition take place and how long did it take? One of the first modern buildings was the Bauhaus in Germany, which was built in 1925. Rather than masonry walls, short spans, and small rooms, you can see column and slab construction, an open floor plan, and an all-glass facade that was attached and hung from the concrete structure. So what was going on at that time? The Model T truck was introduced in 1925. Radiovision was invented. There was no television yet. And the first transatlantic call was made in 1927. All of this pretty much primitive by today's standards. In 1928, the International Congress of Modern Architecture was founded, and the first meeting was held by prominent architects and planners in Switzerland. Physical conditions in European cities were so bad at the time that the attendees established a new set of design and planning principles. They called for function-based zones, separate the housing from the polluted industrial areas. They called for high-rise housing blocks with ample sunlight into housing units, parks, and efficient vehicular circulation. Le Corbusier at the time presented the 5 points toward a new architecture. He called for column wall separation, free the design of the facade and plan, horizontal windows for expansive views, and roof gardens atop buildings. By 1932, modernism had become a style and went international. One could build the same building anywhere in the world and condition it with fossil fuels. For example, in the 30s and 40s, over 4,000 Bauhaus and international style buildings were built in Tel Aviv alone, much less the rest of the world. In 1935, at that same time, we had the first commercial airport opened. In 1949, Philip Johnson designed his all-glass, single-pane, single-glass house in New Canaan, Connecticut, a cold climate with very hot summers. Of course, you can condition any space with inexpensive fossil fuels. In 1952, the beautiful Lever House, glass curtain wall, high-rise building opened. And in 1956, we had Brasilia, the first new town based on the modern planning principles. So, how long did it take to change the world, to go from the Bauhaus to the Lever House? It took just 27 years. And we did all this with these design tools, a T-square triangle. We had an ink pen, but you had to dip it in an inkwell. And when you drew a line, with a T-square or by the triangle, many times the ink would slip in under the T-square and triangle, and you have to scrape off the ink with a razor blade. We couldn't design real curves, only maybe a semicircle, because we couldn't dimension it. We only had French curves at that time, and all the calculations were done with a slide rule. In fact, we didn't get the first drawing ink pen until 1960, a rapidograph, and the first laptop computer in 1991.
We know that globally, urban environments are responsible for over 70% of all human-produced greenhouse gas emissions.
So, what can we in the planning, architecture, and design and principles from proven strategies and sources worldwide? And as we apply these principles, we are ushering in a new era in design and planning.
First, let's look at the 5 urban planning principles. Number 1, establish urban boundaries, plan and resilient developments that mitigate the impacts of climate change. 2, create and restore natural environments, urban forests, living shorelines, and protect farmland and historic sites, and also create urban parks. 3, plan transit-oriented developments that align with density and locate residential, commercial, and recreational areas near transit hubs. 4, create inclusive mixed-use neighborhoods that combine residences, businesses, workplaces, and civic services. And 5, plan for small blocks, human-scale streets, and walking and biking. So let's review the 5 urban planning principles. Growth boundaries and compact, resilient developments. Natural environments, open lands and parks. Now, the 5 architecture, design, and construction principles. 1, electrify and incorporate passive solar heating, cooling, daylighting, natural ventilation systems, and integrate on-site and/or energy. Use no on-site fossil fuels to operate buildings. 2, reuse, adapt, renovate, and restore buildings instead of constructing new ones. The old saying goes, well, it's actually a new saying by one of our colleagues, the greenest building is one that is already built. 3, create carbon sequestering landscapes and infrastructures, pave less and plant more to mitigate the impacts of climate change. 4, design buildings for disassembly so we can reuse most of their materials at the end of life of a building, and optimize structure and use locally sourced, nature-based materials. This reduces built environment carbon. And 5, map present and future climate changes and design to mitigate their impacts. To review the 5 architecture, design, and construction principles. Electrification, passive systems, and renewable energy. Reuse, adapt, renovate, and restore buildings. carbon sequestering landscapes and infrastructure, building for disassembly, optimized structure, and nature-based materials. And the fifth, mapping and designing for climate impacts. So how do we achieve a zero carbon built environment? Well, it's a two-step process. Step one is applying the 10 planning, design, and construction principles and strategies that we've just reviewed. And step two is adding renewable energy. Applying the principles will get us 70 to 80% of the way to zero carbon through no cost, low cost, and cost savings options. Step two, adding renewables, gets us the other 20 to 30%. This includes building integrated solar and wind electricity generation to community and utility scale solar, wind, and hydro. You can find many of these mitigation and adaptation strategies at 2030palette.org. Now, let's look at how much solar energy falls on each square meter of surface in a year in 4 different locations: in Buenos Aires, New York way up north, Jerusalem, and in the southern hemisphere, Brisbane. So I'm going to put in motion how much energy is delivered free to 4 different surfaces: the roof, south facade, east and west facade, in those 4 locations. You could see that in Buenos Aires, on a flat surface on the roof, you get about 2,000 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. You get the same in Jerusalem and Brisbane. You get about half as much, for example, in New York. Now I'm going to put in motion how much energy a building needs in kilowatt hours per square meter of floor area per year. So a primary school will need about 138 kilowatt hours per square meter per year, an office building about 100, and an apartment building about 150 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. So you can see those on the right, the 2 red bars. Those are buildings built to a roughly fairly good energy conservation code. Now, on the right is what you would need for a somewhat efficient building of those building types in kilowatt hours per square meter per year. And on the left is how much you get in kilowatt hours per square meter per year on 4 different surfaces. You get so much more energy that falls on each surface free over a year than you need to operate a building. We just have to harness that energy, store it, and use it at the times when we need it. Let's look at energy distribution worldwide. You can see that in the global north, you're in the yellow and green-blue range, the low end of the energy spectrum. And if we look at the Middle East and Israel, you're essentially at the high end of the spectrum. So you get about double the amount of energy per square meter in that region than you would if you were in the global north. So you need about half the amount of collector area that you would need in the global north to collect the same amount of energy. So we could say that the global south is essentially energy rich. In 2020, solar energy became the cheapest way to generate electricity in history. By 2022, solar, wind, and renewable energy generation had unprecedented growth due to its inexpensive cost, as well as global energy security concerns that was spurred on by the war in Ukraine. Just one year, world renewable energy recorded a 50% growth, with countries pledging to triple their renewable energy capacity by the year 2030. And here you can see that world renewable energy capacity is now growing exponentially. In 2022, about 40% of the world's electricity was generated with non-CO2 sources, mostly wind, solar, and hydro. In Israel, however, renewables and non-CO2 emitting sources made up only about 10% of Israel's electricity generation. In 2020, the government issued a target of generating 30% of the country's electricity from renewables by the year 2030. And in 2023, it mandated that all non-residential buildings incorporate rooftop solar. However, these don't go nearly far enough by international standards and what's required to address the climate crisis that's upon us now. Given its location and economic ability, the country should increase its electricity generation target to 50% by 2030. And its mandate should include all new residential buildings and major residential and commercial renovations. So, can we meet the 1.5 degrees C carbon budget? The answer is, of course we can. We just need to set about doing it. We have everything we need. Thank you.
So Ed, thank you very much. And I wanted to ask the first question, and hopefully other people will also want to join. But this was really, really inspiring, and seems almost too simple to reach a zero carbon future. But if you can comment, please, on the problem that we have with high rise. So on one hand, the high rise is very compact in energy consumption, but on the other hand, we have a lot of GFA with very small rooftops, and these rooftops are typically covered by MEP mechanical systems. So how do you see that, and what needs to be done in that area?
Well, there are things going on. There are all the mid-road things now that give you more roof area, and in terms of planning principles, bring the scale down to a little more human scale. But on the other hand, you're right, high-rise buildings are very compact. There's a company, actually, I think where you studied in Toronto. It's either Toronto or the West Coast. I think it's Toronto, but it's called Solar Skyrise, and they're looking at high-rise buildings as the walls, the east, west, and south wall, which I showed on the screen as the collector area. So rather than the roof you're right, on high rises there's not much. You do have huge amount of wall area, and that's now becoming more prevalent. We're beginning to see that. Also, many of the larger firms are looking into how to get to zero carbon and carbon positive in high-rise buildings. Like Skidmore has a program called Urban Sequoia, looking at its high-rise buildings being net positive in terms of emissions. So there's quite a bit going on. There's also a lot going on when it comes to site work and infrastructure. And a woman named Pamela Conrad has a new free program out called Pathfinder. Her website is carbonpositive.com or org, I can't remember. But anyway, it'll actually go through the things that you need to make your site work and infrastructure carbon positive, and it has a calculator in it on you can calculate the payback on when the green infrastructure begins to absorb more carbon than was used to actually create the infrastructure. We also see that with high-rise buildings, if you're working with the transportation systems and funneling people in and out to the inner cities where most of the high rises are, the transportation then emissions go way down. So that's also a plus when you're talking about high rise buildings and infill. So there are pluses and minuses to everything, but there's a solution to both high rise, mid rise, and low rise.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Ed. I'll add another question here, and then I see we're getting some in the chat. How do you practically suggest implementing the urban design principles in existing communities? It's not a problem we have as much here in Israel, though it is prevalent, but also in communities in America, there's a lot of these spread out low-rise developments. So is there any experiences in your career that you've seen that have been policy changes or practical changes or even pilots where they've successfully changed the infrastructure towards keeping the development and from spreading out with practical solutions? Yeah,
well, so first, let me point to the real expert on that is Peter Calthorpe. And he's a planner and has been doing this for many years. I met Peter way back in the 70s and 80s. He has a new book out that you can actually download from his website. He works for HDR. So if you look up Calthorpe and HDR and you go on and look at Calthorpe, it's Ending Urban Sprawl. And he goes through all the strategies of both low-rise, let me see, how does he call it? Is it low-rise and high-rise sprawl? Or, he talks about all the different kinds of sprawl, low-income and high-income sprawl, things like that, and gives you all the strategies that you need to alleviate urban sprawl and prevent it from reproducing itself all over. And many of the principles that I showed come from actually directly from Peter, some of them. In terms of low-rise is so easy to existing low-rise. So first or existing sprawl, suburban development, so single family. They're so easy to add solar to, it's a no-brainer. And so things like the IRA, which the government is putting out, which is a 30% tax credit if you install solar on a residence that you own, for example, is huge. And we're beginning to see many people in single family housing take advantage of that and put up solar panels, because in a few years you pay back the panels and then you have free electricity essentially, because in a single family you have so much area. You build a carport and stick them on the carport, put them on the roof. There's also places in suburban development or sprawl development. So there are lots of ways to deal with that, and I would point you, because it's a big subject, to Peter's book and the website, the HDR website, because he has all the principles and guidelines and talks about the different ways that people are addressing that issue all over the world. And he looks at Mexico, and he looks at the Middle East and the Far East, and so he's looking at all the different strategies that are being implemented and what works, and explains what works and what doesn't work. So that's where I'd point you to. I'd point you to the expert on that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll definitely look into that. And we have another comment and question here from Michael Truesdell for WSP. He was also listening to you at Architecture 2030 presentation in 2007 and found it inspiring like Ken did. And his question is, would you comment on the role of legislation and minimum standards set by governments to achieve the Architecture 2030 goals?
Yeah, absolutely critical. So the global ABC, so you ought to look that up too. They just put out their latest report. And it's the global organization that tries to aggregate all the professional organizations in the built environment worldwide, but mostly the building sector. And it's been keeping tabs on codes worldwide, and which countries have adopted them and how stringent they are, and which editions they've done. We're getting better at it globally, of countries adopting codes. ASHRAE does a good job for commercial mid-rise housing with their code standard. We developed a zero carbon code standard that was adopted by the IECC, International Energy Conservation Code, as an appendix. So any jurisdiction that adopts the 2021 IECC, the local jurisdiction can adopt the appendix, which then points you to how to get to a zero carbon new building when you build a building or a major renovation. And it's essentially adding the renewable portion. So using the code for efficiency and then adding the renewables, as we said, it's going to be about 20% of the issue to get to zero carbon. So codes are really important, and keeping up with the code standards, they get more stringent every 3 years. And the interesting thing about codes is when people talk about codes, oh, it's going to be expensive or this or that. In order to develop a code, the code organization that's developing it has to demonstrate that every change that they make is cost effective. That means there's a very, very quick payback in terms of energy consumption and the cost of energy in a location. To make that change, it has to actually demonstrate that. And then the organization then adopts that change every 3 years. They adopt a bunch of changes and make the code a little more stringent. So the codes are incredible. If I would show you what a typical building uses, in terms of energy, and if you build it to the latest code standard, it's way down here, in which case you only need a very little bit of renewables to take care of the rest. You'd be amazed. But we're starting to see now, both globally and in the U.S., our carbon footprint per square, in the U.S. is per square foot or per square meter of floor area, is coming way down. We're about 40% less than we were 10 years ago in 12, 13 years ago in 2010. Our energy, our carbon emissions for building operations per square meter is about 40% less than it was back in 2010. So what that's saying is that not only are we adopting, really good code standards for new buildings that aren't using much and getting to zero, starting to get to zero carbon now, but we're renovating enough buildings to zero carbon or to become even very more efficient, that our carbon footprint in the entire sector is dropping dramatically. So in the US, we are now about 31.5% below 2005 levels in the building sector, building operations. We've reduced our emissions, even though we've added about, I want to say close to 80 billion square feet of building floor area. So we keep building in the US and our emissions keep going down per area per floor area. And the reason is we're renovating to code standards, and the professions are moving towards zero carbon design.
Encouraging to hear. Thank you. And we have another question here about building tools. You spoke about a little bit about the sort of tools used up until the 1960s and the development that was possible only with pen and paper. I'm interested to hear your opinion on more advanced environmental simulation tools available nowadays versus rule of thumb designs, and what you think is more relevant for designing sustainable or net zero buildings today.
Yeah, I think the rules of thumb are absolutely critical, because that's where the decisions are made. So when you're designing a building, and we all have rules of thumb in our head as architects and designers and planners and stuff, and we've aggregated them, over years of, from professional training in universities to practice, and those become essentially how we lay out buildings and the form of buildings and the shape and where we locate spaces and all that kind of stuff. Once we get there and we then start doing simulations and things like that, you're usually locked into a bunch of things, and then you're tweaking rather than just throwing things out and having a whole new concept and stuff that works. So the rules of thumb become really critical in design. And then the simulations, once you get a form up and you get a building up and you've located the spaces and stuff, the simulations become important. There are a host of tools. I ended practice 15 years ago, and practice for about 50. And then started Architecture 2030, and we've been advocates. So I'm not up to speed on the latest design tools, but I know Autodesk and stuff, they'll do, and Sapphira and programs like that. I'm sure there are many others, Tally and a whole bunch of others, that'll do what we called for about 15 years ago. We called for those programs to give you instantaneous energy consumption and emissions numbers as you're designing. So you can see with a little box in the corner when you're making decisions whether emissions go up and energy consumption goes up or it goes down. So if I orient my building a little differently, I add a more glass area here, and so the heating load goes down and things like that. So the programs are getting pretty sophisticated. When we were designing, with T-squares and triangles, there was none of that going on. So and now there are more programs. So so there are 3 or 2. One is the CARE tool. It's caretool.org or .com, all one word, and that'll give you how much energy and emissions you would save if you save a building and renovate it rather than tear it down and build new. It'll give you the difference. So that's a new tool that just came out, and it's going international now. It was in the US, and now they're broadening the scope of that tool. Pathfinder, as I said, with Pamela Conrad, is a brand new tool on infrastructure, and that's when I saw that, she was a sole practitioner who developed it on her own because it wasn't there. And then finally, we worked with her to get funding to really expand it and make it more sophisticated and get it out there. So those two are critical. And I know Peter Calthorpe they have a tool, and I can't remember the name of it actually, but it'll look at large areas and give you the emissions in terms of when you're looking over a city, for example, or a neighborhood, it'll give you numbers, so that then you can initiate plans based on the information that's there. I can't remember what the name of that one is, but anyway, if you look Peter up, you'll find it.
Great, thank you so much. We have another question here about what the little guy can do. Where should the focus be? How can individuals impact decarbonization in their homes, their communities?
Yeah, I think community solar now is all of a sudden it's really starting to take root. Right here in New Mexico, our local utility would try to fight it, and it got voted down unanimously. So to encourage community solar, where you get an entire community then building the solar systems on the buildings and then owning the distribution and things like that. Community solar, is one way. I think it was Harrison Fraker put out a book on community energy systems that communities can get together and then, and then build and develop. Let's see, I'm trying to think on the individual level, if there are incentives. So for example, we put up a carport and a solar system, in our house. We have we essentially built a passive solar house with hot water heating, solar hot water heating, but we didn't have, we didn't generate electricity. But when they gave out the tax credits, the 30% tax credits, we then looked into that and boom, popped it on. So in places where you have incentives, that's why incentives are so important. When you have incentives, you then do it. And so we try to get as low as we can, but once the incentives came out, we wanted to go to zero as quickly as possible. So I would, so for the individual, one, we're seeing architects get involved in local decisions and different kinds of ways to do things, incentives, and talking to their local politicians in developing those incentives and adopting the latest code standards. So being a citizen or architect advocate is becoming really important, and we're beginning to see that quite a bit now, because no one knows more about the built environment and about buildings and about building structures and those things than the architecture community. So when they speak up at a community hearing or at local legislative hearing, they're taken very, very seriously, rather than just somebody who doesn't want something in his backyard or something like that, because they know what they're talking about. And so becoming a citizen or a professional advocate is absolutely critical. We're seeing that everywhere, where the community gets together, and especially the larger firms that are doing work internationally, because they design the signature buildings. And it's so important for them to get that right, because then people start copying it and things like that, because they're so prominent. These buildings are so prominent. So we're pushing our major international firms to really become super conscious and sign on to these targets, and then talk with them about when they're meeting them, when they're not meeting them, and push them to do more all the time. And they really have. Most of them have stepped up to the plate. So we're really thrilled about that, and we're seeing the numbers come down. We're starting to see the numbers come down. In the U.S., we're seeing them come down. Europe, they're coming down. Globally, they're flat. So they've flattened out, at least. They haven't been coming down yet.
Very much. And I think we'll have time for one or two more questions. So here's the final question from the chat. I was wondering, how does the challenging architecture 2030 zero carbon targets account for the existing building stock, which will have to undergo major energy renovations?
Yeah, as I talked about, the way that we proposed to do that way back when we first issued the 2030 challenge, we called for getting to reducing the carbon emissions and the energy consumption in any new building and major renovation, because it's easy to do when you're doing a major renovation. So the cost is almost negligent. If you're replacing windows, for example, or if you have to replace your HVAC system, or right now the key is electrification, right? So if you have on-site, you're using natural gas or for whatever reason, then electrify. Why? Because we're pushing the utilities to go to all renewables. And right now, the utility, it's so cheap. It's cheaper to an existing coal plant that's operating now, that's in good shape. It's cheaper to tear it down and take it out and put in the solar renewables. You would actually get cheaper electricity for your customers to do that because renewables are so cheap. And when you look at fossil fuel electricity, the cost is always going up. The cost of renewables every single year is going down. It's down about 80% or 90% from where it was, 15 years ago, in terms of applying solar energy. If you look at the graphs, they're unbelievable. One is like this, dropping like off a cliff, and the other is always going up slightly. And they've crossed already. You saw, I showed you where they crossed in 2020. So already they've crossed now, and the price keeps dropping for renewables. So the key is to renovate when you're to making sure the code kicks in, or any major renovation, you get to zero. You establish a zero carbon target for the renovations, because over time you will renovate every building. Every building has a life expectancy. All the buildings that are out there now, there's quite a bit of them that are reaching that point where they have to be renovated. And when you undergo a major renovation, it's a no-brainer to put in the more efficient systems. There's pretty much very little cost difference nowadays. And in some cases, you can actually even save money in terms of your utility bills going down. Will save you on an annual basis what additionally you put into just upgrading. So the key is really electrifying existing buildings. When you're renovating them, just electrify them. Get rid of any on-site natural gas when you can, and then add the renewables.
Great, thank you. And our final question here is Oren from Oren HDR Engineering. Thank you for the interesting presentation. I want to ask how we facilitate the lack of space in a very dense urban areas where renewables are harder to apply with the dense areas that are easier with renewable projects, but there's less demand for it. How's the energy storage field is evolving? Conveyance?
Yeah, the energy storage is also fascinating, and that is, we see the same thing with battery storage. That cost is coming down. We're now seeing, which is really fascinating, we know that, for example, car batteries, electric, EVs, those batteries are huge compared to the batteries you could get to put into a residence, for example, things like that. And so we're now seeing bidirectional energy, where you can actually pull energy off to charge your battery, and then when the building needs energy, get back to the building, because these batteries are so huge. So we're beginning to see that happen. The key is electrification of all buildings, and then to push the utilities to generate renewable electricity, because there you're doing it off-site and in areas where you have shading and things like that, where you just can't do it all on site. Then the key is to import that electricity and that it be renewable electricity. So we've got to push the utilities to do that.
Great. Thank you so much, Ed. Thank you for your wonderful presentation, which was inspiring and insightful and gave us a lot of practical tools that we can use here. And we really appreciate your answering all our questions and giving us some practical advice and where to look next and what to do next. We really hope that everyone joins us to continue the conversation on the 19th of what we can do here in Israel to reduce embodied carbon, operational carbon, and then think about the pathways to get to zero. And we hope to see it just continue to grow here in Israel. And we'll be in touch, Ed, in terms of hearing what's happening next from you. So thank you very much to everyone, and have a great night.
Thank you so much.